A boy dragged through the grass with his neck locked in a heavy wooden collar. A prisoner, a trophy, paraded at feasts so drunken warriors could laugh at him, became, within a single lifetime, master of more land than any conqueror who ever lived. Not more land than Alexander, not more than Napoleon, more than Alexander, Napoleon, and Rome at its greatest, all of them together. And it wasn't close. And here's the part that most people never hear. Nothing about it was written in the stars. He was not born to rule. He almost died forgotten a dozen times before he turned 30, hunted, hungry, betrayed, collared like an animal, his wife stolen, his family left on the open steppe to freeze or starve. If you had met him at 20, you would not have bet a single sheep on his future. Neither would anyone who knew him. According to legend, his birth was auspicious, because he came into the world holding a clot of blood in his hand. Yet his early years were anything but promising. He started from what the sources themselves call obscure and insignificant beginnings. The story of how that boy in the wooden collar became the man the civilized world would call the Scourge of God. That is one of the strangest, most brutal, and most human stories the past has ever handed down to us. And almost everything about it is more astonishing than the legend. If stories like this, real history, told the way it actually happened, with the myths peeled away, are the kind of thing you want more of, take a second to subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep digging into the past. Now, back to the steppe. To understand why one man united this world, you first have to understand why, for centuries, no one else could. Picture the land itself. Mongolia is a sea of grass, endless, treeless plains rolling east to west, ringed by mountains and cut through by cold rivers like the Onon and the Kerlen. It is beautiful in the way a knife is beautiful. It does not forgive. Summers are short and dry. Winters drop far below freezing and last half the year. There are no cities out here, no walls, no roads worth the name. Just grass, sky, wind, and the animals a family lives and dies by. Everything, and I mean everything, depended on the herd. Horses, sheep, goats, cattle, camels, meat, milk, wool, hides, dung for fires, animals to ride and to trade. A family with a good herd survived. A family that lost its animals, to a raid, to a bad winter, to a disease that swept the flock, that family was finished. There was no safety net, no stored grain in a granary, no lord to petition, no charity. Raids, murders, kidnappings, and savage killings were not only common, but expected on any given day. And the killer was the weather. There is a Mongolian word for a winter disaster where the ground freezes so hard the animals cannot dig down to grass, and the herd starves standing up in the snow, thousands of them dead within days. One such winter, and a rich family became beggars. Think of it like a single night wiping out an entire family's savings, their house, their car, and their means of ever earning again, all at once, with nothing left. That was the logic of the steppe. That is why people fought so viciously over pasture and animals and water, not out of cruelty for its own sake, out of fear, because the margin between comfort and death was one bad season wide. Now, fill that grass with people who did not trust each other. This was not one nation. It was a patchwork of tribes and clans, each looking after its own, each ready to raid the next. Historians describe the plateau as a five-way standoff between the biggest players. Across the plateau, from east to west, 4 major power blocks: the Tatar, the Mongol, the Karit, and the Naiman, and the northern Merkit bloc coexisted in a five-way standoff. Between and beneath them swarmed dozens of smaller clans, splitting, merging, betraying, marrying into one another, and murdering one another in the same breath. And there was no such thing as a permanent alliance. These entities operated in a system of shifting alliances, driven by marriage ties, kinship obligations, and opportunistic pacts, rather than enduring hierarchies, leading to chronic instability and intertribal raids over limited grazing lands. Think of the whole steppe as a poker table, where every player is armed, no one trusts the dealer, the chips are living animals, and the loser doesn't just go home broke, the loser's family gets carried off. That was steppe politics. These groups lacked centralized authority, with leadership rotating among khans based on kinship ties and military prowess, leading to frequent shifts in power through assassinations and coups. And from the 1180s onward, dry conditions made resources scarcer still, as herds dwindled and migrations overlapped, feeding a cycle of raids that destabilized alliances. A drying climate meant less grass. Less grass meant hungrier herds. Hungrier herds meant desperate men, and desperate men on horseback, with bows they'd trained on since childhood, meant blood. There's one more thing you have to understand, because the whole story turns on it. On the steppe, your identity was your bloodline. Who your father was, which clan you belonged to, how noble your line, that decided everything. It decided who fought beside you, who owed you loyalty, who you could marry, whether you ate first at the feast or scraped the leftovers. Loyalty flowed along blood. A stranger owed you nothing. Kin owed you everything. Remember that. Hold on to it. Because the boy at the center of this story was going to be betrayed by his own blood and saved by strangers, again and again, until he drew a conclusion that no one on the steppe had ever dared to build a world on. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, that world had to break him. His father was a man named Yasuge. Not a great king, let's be honest about that. He was a prominent figure of the Borjigan clan, but he was not a great Khan who ruled the entire steppe. He led a tribe of a few thousand people, not a world-shaking hero. A capable raider, a decent warrior, a minor chief. His own grandfather had once tried to unite the Mongols and briefly managed to stand up to the great Jin Empire down in China. But that had crumbled. By Yasugai's day, the Mongols were poor and scattered, the runts of the plateau, bullied by bigger tribes. Yasugai had made enemies the way steppe men made enemies, with a raid. Years before his son was even born, he had captured a Tatar warrior in battle, a man named Temujin Uge. The secret history of the Mongols records that Temujin was named after Temujin Uge in commemoration of this victory. Sit with that for a second. He named his firstborn son after a man he had defeated, a walking trophy, a boast in the shape of a child. That name was a debt waiting to be collected, and the Tatars had long memories. The boy grew up as steppe children did, on horseback before he could properly walk, a bow in his hands as soon as he could draw one. And around the age of 9, his father took him on a long ride to arrange his marriage, the way it was done, to bind two families together. The secret history records that Yasugai left Temujin at the home of Dai Setsun, a nobleman of the Kongarad tribe, after the two fathers had agreed that their children, Temujin and Borte, would marry. The boy stayed behind to live with his future in-laws and learn their ways. His father turned for home alone. That ride home is where everything came apart. On his way home, Yasuge noticed an encampment where some Tartars were having a wedding feast. He was hungry, or tired,
or simply following the old law of the steppe that a traveler shares a meal. And here the sources are painfully specific. Yasuge wanted to join the celebration, but he knew he could not reveal his identity, since he was known among the Tartars as the person who killed their relative in a battle years earlier. He tried to pass unrecognized. It didn't work. The Tartars recognized him and poisoned his food. Although ill, Yasuge managed to escape back to his family's camp. He died 3 days later at home. Think about what those 3 days were. A man riding across open grass, the poison already working through him, knowing what was coming, racing to reach his family before it killed him. He made it. Barely.
And this is the piece that gives the whole thing its terrible weight. Under steppe law, this was not just murder. According to the law of the steppe, poisoning a guest was the worst taboo. The Tatars welcomed Yasuge as a guest and then betrayed him. This was not simple murder, but a desecration of sacred custom. They broke the one rule that let strangers travel and eat among enemies at all. And the man who had once thrown his son's name in their faces now paid for it with his life. The boy was summoned home. He rode as fast as any 9-year-old could ride across that country. He was too late. Yasuge died 3 days after arriving home. Temujin was urgently summoned, but did not see his father's last moments. His father was already gone. And this is the moment the real ordeal began. Because on the steppe, a dead chief left a very dangerous vacuum, and the vultures were already circling. Yasuge had held his people together by force of personality and reputation. Take that away, and what remained was a widow, some small children, and a herd that other men wanted. The custom said a dead man's brother should marry the widow and fold the family into his own household, keeping them safe. Yasuge's brothers did not step up, and into that gap moved a rival clan, the Taichiud, led by a man named Targutai, who saw not a family in mourning, but an opportunity. What happened next is one of the coldest moments in the whole story, and it's worth slowing down for, because it's documented, and it explains everything the boy became. The tribe decided to move camp, and they decided to leave the widow and her children behind. Now, the boy's mother was named Hoelun, and she does not get nearly enough credit in the legend, so let's give it to her. When she understood that her people were about to ride off and abandon her family to die on the open grass, she didn't beg. She raced after them, clutching Yasuge's spirit banner. She invoked his authority and confronted the Taichiud Khan. She shamed them into staying put. Picture that. A widow, alone, on foot, holding up the horsetail standard of her dead husband, the sacred banner of his line, chasing down an entire tribe on horseback and shaming grown warriors into stopping. For a moment it worked. For a moment. They stayed put till nightfall, then skulked off as the family slept. They crept away in the dark like thieves so they wouldn't have to look her in the eye. And when they went, the tribe secretly abandoned the camp, with all livestock and property plundered. They took the animals. The herd, the one thing standing between this family and death, gone. So picture what's left. A woman, a handful of children, the eldest not yet 10. No tribe, no herd, no protection. Alone on a steppe where alone means dead. This is the family of the man who would one day rule from the Pacific to the edge of Europe. At this moment, they are the lowest of the low.
below beggars, below slaves, because a slave at least belongs to someone. They belong to no one. What saved them was the mother.
With Yasuge dead, the rival family had abandoned his widow and children, considering them too weak to exercise leadership. Too weak. That was the judgment of the steppe. Hoyalun spent the next several years proving it wrong, with her bare hands. She took them to the Kenti Mountains, where they lived for several years, eking out an existence through fishing and grubbing roots. The secret history remembers what those years actually looked like, and the detail is almost unbearably vivid. It describes the mother hoisting up her skirts and running along the banks of the river day after day, gathering wild pears and berries and digging roots out of the frozen ground to fill her children's bellies, feeding them on onions and garlic pulled from the earth, keeping the sons of her body alive on a diet of seeds and scraps. This is not a queen. This is a woman on her knees in the dirt, clawing food out of the soil so her children live one more day. And the children learned to feed themselves. They fished the river with hooks. For the next few years, the family lived the life of impoverished nomads, surviving primarily on wild fruits, marmots, and other small game hunted by the boys. Marmots, think fat ground squirrels, hunted with a child's bow. Roots, river fish, whatever the grass and the water would give up. And through winters that could kill a grown man in a night, wrapped in whatever they had, they simply did not die. Every day was the whole of the ambition. Not power, not glory, just survive until tomorrow. Now, hold that image of the starving family, because I need you to understand what it did to the eldest boy, so that the next thing he does doesn't just look like a crime, it looks like the whole steppe pressing down on one child until something inside him decided who was going to be in charge. Because there was a rival in that yurt, his own half-brother. Yasuge had 2 wives in the way of steppe men, and so the boy had 2 older half-brothers by the second wife, one of them named Bector. And with the father dead and the family clinging to survival, a quiet, ugly struggle started over the oldest question there is: who's in charge now? The older half-brother deprived 14-year-old Temujin and his brother Kasar of their spoils. Bector was bigger and older, and he used it, taking the food the younger boys hunted, throwing his weight around, positioning himself as the head of a family that had nothing left to head. Then came the day the sources all remember, because it's so small and so enormous at the same time. It was over a fish. One day, when the 4 brothers were sitting alongside one another pulling in their lines, they caught a bright fish. Bector and his brothers snatched the small fish away from Temujin and Kasar. A single fish, and a lark or a small bird taken from starving boys by their bigger brother. And the younger 2 went to their mother. Her answer is one of the most quietly devastating lines in the whole chronicle, because of what it reveals about how trapped they all were. Hoyalun listened to them and said, "Why do you, older and younger brothers, behave in such a way towards one another?" That's it. No solution, no justice, no answer. Just despair dressed up as a question. How can you fight each other when fighting each other is all that's left? She couldn't fix it. There was nothing to fix it with. Temujin, seeing that his mother provided no answer in how to deal with the situation, took it upon himself to impose justice. What he did next was not a fight. It was an execution, and the sources describe it with chilling precision. Temujin and Kasar decided it was time for payback and stalked Bector. Eventually, they found their brother watching over the horses. Temujin stalked up from behind, while his brother stalked up from in front. 2 boys, closing in from two sides, on their own brother, with bows drawn. They surrounded him where he sat guarding the family's horses, and they shot him. There is a detail here that historians can't quite let go of. As he was dying, Bektar is said to have asked for one thing, that they spare his full brother, Belgutai. Just before his death, Bektar asked his brother Temujin to spare his younger brother Belgutai, and Temujin kept his promise. And he did. Belgutai lived and served at his brother's side loyally for the rest of a very long life. But Bektar bled out into the grass. Now, some historians look at this and see only a child murderer. Others look harder and wonder if there's more to it. One line of argument holds that a rivalry over a stolen fish is a strangely thin reason to kill your own brother, and asks whether Bektar might have been something worse, a spy, a link to the very enemies who wanted the family dead, which, under Mongol belief, would have made him not just a bully, but a traitor whose blood demanded spilling. That's a theory, not a fact, and I want to be honest that the sources don't prove it. What the sources do give us is the mother's reaction, and that is beyond dispute. When the two boys came back to the yurt, she took one look at their faces and knew. When Temujin and his brother came back, Hoyalun saw the look upon her sons' faces and knew what they had done. In her grief, she lashed out and called them destroyers. The chronicle records her curse in full, that she had brought a killer into the world, a boy who burst from her womb clutching a clot of blood, and that now, when the family had no friend but their own shadow, no whip but a horse's tail, he had turned that violence on his own kin. She cursed her own son, and he said nothing back. There was nothing to say. And here is the thing I keep circling back to, because it tells you who this person was becoming. He was maybe 13 or 14 years old. He had lost his father to poison, been abandoned by his tribe, watched his mother dig roots to keep him alive, and his response to a challenge for authority in the household was not to argue, not to compromise, not to run. It was to eliminate the rival completely and permanently. That instinct, total, cold, final, is the same instinct that would one day empty entire cities. It was already there, in a starving teenager over a stolen fish. But killing on the steppe never stayed private. Spilling a relative's blood on the earth was considered a crime against the sky itself, and it could not go unanswered. And there were men out there who had been waiting for an excuse. The rival clan that had abandoned the family, the Taichiud, heard that the fledgling had grown feathers. The boy they'd left to die had become a young man and a killer, and that made him a threat. So they came for him. The chronicle even preserves the words they came saying, and there's something menacing in how casual it is. They rode in, declaring that the nestlings had grown their wings, the drooling babies had grown up. They wanted only him, not the family, him. He fled into thick forest, and here the story turns into something out of a nightmare. He fled into dense forest. He spent 9 days without food, 9 days, hiding, hunted, starving in the trees. And the secret history preserves the exact thought that finally broke him and sent him out into their hands. The secret history records his thought at the breaking point. "Why die nameless? I'll go out." He emerged and was captured. Why die nameless? Sit with that phrase, coming from a hunted, starving boy with nothing, no tribe, no herd, no future. Even then, even at the bottom, some part of him refused the idea of vanishing without a trace. He would rather walk into the enemy's hands than disappear from memory.
It's the first flash of the thing that would drive everything that came after. They took him, and they made an example of him. They put him in a kang, a heavy wooden collar that immobilized his arms, preventing him from feeding himself or even drinking water. He was rotated from family to family, one knight per household, a slave and an exhibit. Understand what that device was. A kang is a thick wooden board locked around the neck and wrists, a portable set of stocks, so heavy and wide the wearer can't reach his own mouth to eat or drink, can't scratch an itch, can't lie down properly, depends utterly on someone else to be fed like an infant. Imagine your head and hands locked into a wooden door you have to carry everywhere you go, day and night, for months. That was his life. And they didn't just imprison him, they humiliated him. Their leader mocked the captive at feasts as the wretched son of Yasuge, the son of a poisoned minor chief, collared and displayed while warriors drank and laughed. This is the boy who would rule half the known world. Right now he is a party decoration in a wooden collar. But watch what starts happening, because this is where the shape of his entire future first appears. Among the families forced to guard him, some began to pity him. The subordinate families showed him kindness. An old woman tended the raw wounds the kang cut into his neck. One family in particular, low-ranking people, servants really, headed by a man the sources call Sorkan Shira, quietly took the collar off him at night so he could sleep, and said nothing. And then came the night he ran. One night during a feast, when the guards were drunk, he struck his feeble guard on the head with the wooden collar and ran. He turned the instrument of his torture into a weapon, knocked out the boy watching him, and fled into the dark, still wearing the thing. Where do you hide, collared, on open ground, with a whole tribe about to come looking? He did something clever. He hid in a river with only his face above the water and the kang floating alongside him in the moonlight. Lying in cold water, breathing through the surface, the wooden collar bobbing beside his head under the moon while torch-bearing warriors combed the banks for him. And here, the whole future of the world turned on a single man's decision. The head of that low-ranking family, Sorkan Shira, was part of the search party. He walked the riverbank, and he found him. He looked straight at the collared boy lying in the water, and he chose to lie. He discovered him, but chose to deceive his clansmen, urging them to search elsewhere. He led the hunt in the wrong direction and saved the life of a boy who was nothing to him, not kin, not clan, a fugitive whose discovery could have gotten the whole family killed. When the search failed and night came, the boy dragged himself to that family's tent. When he went to Sorkan Shira's tent, the old man was terrified. Of course he was. Sheltering an escaped prisoner meant death for everyone under that roof. He wanted to send the boy away, and then his own sons said the thing that changed history. His sons said, "When the sparrow took refuge from the hawk in a bush, the bush protected it. Now that he's come to us, how can you talk to him like that? The bush protects the sparrow." So they protected him. They burned the kang and sent him on his way with a barren mare, 2 arrows, no saddle, and no flint. They destroyed the evidence in the fire, gave him a horse and a couple of arrows, and pointed him home. He tracked his family down by following the bent grass along the riverbank, and he was free. Now, here is where you have to stop and look at the whole shape of what just happened, because he certainly did, for the rest of his life. His own blood relatives, the Temujin, his father's own people, had left his family to die, then collared him and paraded him like a beast. And total strangers, low-born servants who owed him absolutely nothing,
had risked their lives and their children's lives to save him. The Taichiud, blood kin, had put his family out to die and tried to break him. But strangers, with no kinship obligation, risked their lives for him. This planted in the boy a conviction that would reshape the world, that loyalty freely given is worth more than the accident of birth, that people should be judged by their actions, not their lineage. And I want to be clear about how radical that is, because it's easy to skate past. On the steppe, your bloodline was your everything, remember. That's the rule the whole society ran on. To decide, based on your own bruised childhood, that blood is worthless and loyalty is everything, that a servant who saves you outranks a cousin who betrays you, that is, in steppe society, a revolution. He didn't invent it in a war tent years later as strategy. He learned it lying in a river under the moon, collared, waiting to see whether a stranger would give him up. And the men who saved him, Sorkan Shira and his sons, he did not forget them. Years later, when he was the most powerful man on the steppe, they stood among his commanders. That was the promise he was already making to himself in the water. He'd also, somewhere in these ragged years, made a friend, a boy from a neighboring family named Jamuka. The two formed a blood brotherhood, an anda, by exchanging knuckle bones and arrows. The relationship between andas was often considered stronger than that between blood brothers and could not be lightly set aside. Think of it as a bond deeper than family, sworn and sacred, two boys promising to be as one. They raced their horses over the frozen rivers together and swore themselves brothers for life. Remember that boy. Remember the word anda. Because the friend who exchanged arrows with him in the snow is the same man who will one day split the entire steppe in two, trying to destroy him. And the day these two blood brothers finally face each other across a battlefield is coming. But before any of that, before the armies and the betrayals, there was a girl he'd been promised to when he was 9 years old. The one his father had ridden off to arrange the match with on that last fatal journey. Her name was Borta. He went back for her. He married her. And within days of the wedding, riders came out of the north in the dark and took her. The Merkit came in the dark because they had a debt to collect, and the debt was old. Years before, when the boy's father was still alive, he had done something that steppe men did all the time. He had stolen a bride. Yesugei had abducted the boy's mother, Höelun, from a Merkit man on the day of her wedding, carried her off across the grass to be his own wife. That was how a poor tribe got wives when it couldn't afford them. And the Merkit had never forgotten. So when the son of that thief married a beautiful woman of his own, they saw a chance to balance the books. An eye for an eye, a bride for a bride. Roughly 300 Merkit riders came out of the north before dawn and fell on the little camp. There was almost no one to fight them. He had a mother, a young wife, a few brothers, and a handful of followers. He did the only thing that kept him breathing his whole young life. He ran. He fled up the sacred mountain Burkhan Khaldun into the forest with his brothers and the men he had, and the Merkit chased him through the trees 3 times around the mountain before giving up. But they took what they came for. They took Borta. And this is where you have to sit inside his skin for a moment, because the chronicle does not soften it. He escaped, and his new wife did not. He hid on the mountain while raiders carried her away to be handed to a Merkit man as a wife. The same fate his mother had suffered a generation before, running in a circle across the same grass. When he came down off that mountain, he was a man with nothing but a grievance and no army to answer it. On the steppe,
That made him a joke. A man who couldn't hold his own, wife held nothing. So he did the thing that would define the rest of his rise. He went and found someone stronger. His father, back when he was alive, had sworn a friendship with a powerful figure, the Khan of the Kharat, a real player, one of the great tribes, a man with tens of thousands of warriors. Father and this Khan had exchanged the oath of Anda, sworn brotherhood. Now the son walked into that Khan's camp, presented himself as the son of the man his host had once sworn brotherhood with, and, according to the sources, offered him a fine sable coat that had been part of his own wife's dowry. He gave away his stolen wife's wedding gift to buy an army to get her back. And it worked. The old Khan was moved, took him as a kind of adopted son, and promised his warriors. And he brought in one more. His Anda, the blood brother from childhood, the boy from the snow, Jamuka, was now a rising leader of his own, with fighters of his own. He called on that old bond, and Jamuka came in with a large force. Between the great Kharat Khan and his blood brother, the friendless fugitive suddenly commanded tens of thousands of horsemen. Understand what just happened. A man with nothing had, on the strength of a dead father's oath and a childhood friendship and one good coat, assembled a coalition army out of thin air. That is not luck. That is a specific, rare talent, the ability to make powerful men want to fight for you. It is the single most important skill he will ever have. They fell on the Merkit at night and shattered them. And in the chaos of the raid, he went looking for one person. The chronicle gives us the scene, and it is one of the few genuinely tender moments in the whole brutal record. He rode through the burning camp, calling her name into the dark, and she, being led away in the confusion by her captors, heard his voice, recognized it, leapt down, and ran to him.
They found each other in the middle of a night raid by the sound of his voice. He had gotten her back, but he had gotten her back pregnant. And here is the shadow that would follow him for the rest of his life, and follow his empire long after he was gone. Roughly 9 months after her rescue, Borta gave birth to a son, Jochi. And no one could ever say for certain, not then, not now, whether the father was her husband or the Merkit man who had held her captive. The name itself, Jochi, is often read as meaning something like guest or the unexpected one. A permanent question mark hung over the boy from the cradle. Now, the husband himself made a choice, and it tells you something. He raised Jochi as his own son, gave him rank, gave him armies, treated him as firstborn. Whatever the truth, he decided the boy was his and dared anyone to say otherwise. But you cannot unask a question like that on the steppe, and the doubt never died. Decades later, at the height of his power, when his sons argued over who would inherit the empire, one of the younger ones would throw it in Jochi's face in front of their father, call him a Merkit bastard, sneer that no one would ever accept the son of a captive as supreme ruler. The old conqueror had to physically intervene to stop his own sons coming to blows. And in the end, Jochi was quietly passed over. It's one of the great what-ifs of history. A single night raid, a single pregnancy, and the succession of the largest land empire ever built was poisoned at the root, before that empire even existed. But all of that is later. In this moment, he was simply a man who had done the impossible, lost everything, and clawed some of it back. And people started to notice. Because something was different about how this man operated, and it broke every rule the steppe ran on. Remember the iron law from before. Blood is everything. Loyalty flows along bloodlines. A noble eats first, and a shepherd eats last. He looked at that system, the system that had let his own kin abandon him to die and collar him like an animal. And he decided to build the opposite. When he won plunder, the custom was that the aristocrats and the clan chiefs took the lion's share, and the common warriors got the scraps. He turned it upside down. He shared the spoils with his ordinary fighters, the herders, the poor men, the nobodies. A common soldier who fought well under him got rich. He also began appointing men to positions of power based on their loyalty and merit rather than their bloodline. Think about what that does to a poor young man on the steppe. Everywhere else, no matter how brave you were, you'd die a servant because your grandfather had been a servant. Under this man, a shepherd could become a general. A slave could command hundreds. It was as if, in a world of locked doors, one man had thrown his open. And word of that traveled across the grass faster than any army. And he rewarded loyalty with a fierceness that became legend. There's a famous moment from a battle against, of all people, his old blood brother, years down the line. During the fight, an arrow struck him in the neck and nearly killed him. Afterward, when the enemy prisoners were brought before him, he stood up and asked who had fired the shot that hit his horse. And one man stepped forward and admitted it, said, "I did it, and if you want to kill me for it, kill me. But if you spare me, I'll fight for you, and I'll be worth it." The Chronicle says the conqueror, instead of executing the man, admired his honesty and courage, took him into his own service, and gave him a new name, Jebe, which means arrow or weapon. That man became one of the greatest generals of the entire empire, a commander who would one day ride around the Caspian Sea and shatter armies in Persia and the Caucasus. Sit with that. An enemy admits to nearly killing him, and instead of vengeance, he gets a promotion. The message that sent across the steppe was unmistakable. Serve me honestly, even against me, and I will raise you higher than your birth ever could. Betray me, and there is no mercy. Loyalty was the only currency that mattered, and he paid it out in land, in animals, in rank, in a share of everything. In a world running on fear and blood, he offered something almost no one else did. A fair deal, kept. So they came to him, slowly at first, then in a flood. Poor men, broken clans, disinherited nobles, runaway servants, whole families who'd been ground down by the endless raiding. They drifted toward him because with him, for the first time, what you did mattered more than who your father was. And here is the quiet genius of it. Every other steppe leader built strength through his kin. He built strength through the discarded Mujins, the very people the old system threw away. He was assembling an army of the loyal out of the wreckage of everyone else's cruelty. Which brings us to the friend. Because his blood brother, Jamuka, was watching all of this, and he did not like what he saw. For a while, the two of them lived side by side, camps joined, the old Anda oath renewed, riding together like the boys they'd been. But they were building two completely different things, and they both knew it. Jamuka was a man of the old order, a brilliant commander, an aristocrat to the bone, a defender of the way things had always been, where noble blood ruled and commoners obeyed. The other man was building the machine that would erase all of that. Two visions of what the steppe should be, sworn as brothers, sharing a fire. The Chronicle marks the break with a strange, cryptic scene that historians still puzzle over. One day, riding together, Jamuka said a single odd sentence about where they should make camp. Something about pitching their tents near the mountain versus near the river, near the horse herders versus near the shepherds. It was almost nonsense on its face, but the wife, Borta, read it as a coded insult or a warning.
a sign that Jamuka was tiring of them and might turn. That night, on her advice, the family broke away in the dark and rode off, splitting from the blood brother rather than sleep another night beside him. And here comes the part that reveals everything. When the two camps split, the people had to choose, and a huge number of Jamuka's own followers, his own commanders, whole clans, got up and rode after the other man instead. Nobles left their aristocratic lord to follow the man who paid his shepherds. That is the moment it became clear which system was winning. And that is the moment the friendship curdled into the deadliest rivalry of his early life. The two men who had exchanged arrows in the snow as boys were now rivals for the soul of the entire steppe. Somewhere in here, his own followers gathered and raised him up as a Khan, a chief in his own right, with his own title. It was a small ceremony. He was still not a great power, but it was a declaration. He was no longer following anyone. He was a contender now. The war between the two blood brothers was long and vicious and came in waves, and I won't drown you in the back and forth of it, because what matters is the shape. At the center of it was a battle the steppe never forgot. Jamuka assembled a grand coalition of tribes who feared the rising man, got himself elected as a rival supreme Khan under an old and dangerous title, and marched. In the huge battle that followed, the coalition broke, and what happened afterward is the thing everyone remembers with a shudder. Jamuka, in the aftermath, is said to have boiled his prisoners alive in cauldrons. Whether it was exactly that, or a punishment of that kind, the ancient sources agree it was an atrocity monstrous even by steppe standards, and it disgusted his own allies. Men who had joined him began to peel away, revolted by their own leader's cruelty. It's one of the great ironies of the whole story. The man defending the old, civilized order of noble blood behaved like a butcher, and the man building the ruthless new war machine was, by comparison, the one men wanted to follow. But do not imagine the rise was smooth, because it very nearly ended in disaster. There was a night, after a brutal defeat, when his coalition scattered and his great patron, the old Kurate Khan, turned against him and hunted him, when he was reduced almost to nothing again. He fled with a tiny remnant of followers to a muddy lake in the middle of nowhere, and there, at the lowest point of his adult life, he made the men who remained swear an oath. They drank the muddy water of that lake together and swore loyalty to one another, to the death. A few thousand men, filthy, beaten, drinking sludge out of a lake, pledging themselves to a leader who had just lost almost everything. Those men, the ones who stayed at the very bottom, who drank the muddy water, were rewarded above all others for the rest of his life, treated as the truest of the true. It was the muddy water oath, and it became a sacred thing. That is how close it came. One more defeat, and there is no empire, no legend, nothing. He rebuilt from a few thousand men and a swamp. And this time, when he rebuilt, he did not just gather more warriors. He tore up the entire system of how steppe armies worked and built something the world had never seen. Start with the problem. A steppe army was really a bundle of separate tribes, each fighting under its own chief, loyal to its own bloodline. If a chief got insulted, or bribed, or scared, he could pull his whole clan off the battlefield in the middle of a fight, and the army would collapse. It was less an army than a temporary business partnership between rival gangs, and everyone knew it. That's exactly why his blood brother's grand coalition had shattered. The parts didn't hold together. So he abolished the tribes, not the people, the structure. He reorganized his entire following into a decimal system, squads of 10. 10 squads made 100. 10 hundreds made 1,000. 10 thousands made a tumen. Simple, clean, and it meant every single man had a clear place in a clear chain of command that ran straight up to him. Think of it like this. The old steppe army was a chaotic crowd where you followed whichever cousin shouted loudest.
The new army was a pyramid, every block resting on the one below, all the weight bearing down to a single point at the top. Him. But the true masterstroke was what he did with the men inside those units. When he formed the squads of 10 and the companies of 100, he deliberately mixed the tribes together. A man from one defeated tribe stood shoulder to shoulder with a man from another, and another. None of them kin. Your old loyalty to your clan was worthless now, because your clan didn't exist as a fighting unit anymore. Your squad of 10 was your new family. You ate with them, fought with them, and if one of you fled in battle, the sources say the whole 10 could be executed. So you did not flee. You held, because the man beside you was holding, and his life was in your hands as yours was in his. Understand what this achieved, because it's the hidden engine of everything that comes after. He took the thing that had destroyed the steppe for centuries, tribal loyalty, blood loyalty, the very thing that had let his own kin betray him, and he dissolved it. He replaced it with loyalty to the unit and loyalty to him. A soldier could not desert to his tribe because his tribe was scattered across 100 different squads. There was nowhere to run back to. For the first time in the history of that grass, an army was not a coalition. It was one body with one will. He backed it with law. He is credited with issuing a body of decrees, the Yasa, a code covering everything from military discipline to theft to the treatment of envoys, punishing betrayal and disorder harshly and rewarding loyalty. On a steppe that had never really had written law, where every dispute was settled by force or feud, that alone was revolutionary. And he built an elite bodyguard, a household guard drawn from across all the tribes, thousands strong, that doubled as a training school for commanders and officials, a place where a shepherd's son who showed talent could rise into the leadership of the whole enterprise. It was, in effect, both the Imperial Guard and the Officer Academy of the New Order, all in one. Add it all up and you get something genuinely new in the world. Not a tribe, not a coalition, a war machine. Disciplined, merciless, promoted on merit, welded together by law and unit loyalty instead of blood, pointed wherever one man chose to point it. Other conquerors inherited armies. This man built one from scratch, out of the very people everyone else had thrown away, and it was better than anything the settled empires to the south had ever faced. By the time he was done, the old blood brother was finished, run down at last, and executed. The great Khan, who had once adopted him and then betrayed him, gone. The proud Naaman in the west, crushed. Tribe by tribe, the entire steppe, this whole shattered world of feuding clans that no one in history had ever managed to unite, had fallen under one man. The five-way standoff was over. There was only one power left standing on the grass. And so the tribes came together for a great assembly on the banks of a river. All the peoples of the steppe gathered in one place under one man to give him a title. Not just Khan, something no one had ever claimed. A name that meant something like universal or oceanic ruler. A lord not of one tribe, but of everything under the eternal blue sky. From that day, the boy who had worn a wooden collar,
would be known by a name the settled world was about to learn to fear. And the machine he had built, the finest fighting force on Earth, would now turn its eyes away from the empty grass and toward the walled cities, the packed farmlands, and the ancient, glittering, unsuspecting kingdoms of the sown world beyond. They gathered on the banks of a river near the source of the Onan, all the peoples of the grass, the very tribes that had spent centuries murdering one another over horses and pasture, now sitting under one sky and one man. And they gave him a title. Not chief, not Khan of the Mongols, something that had never been claimed on that steppe, or perhaps anywhere. Genghis Khan.
The exact meaning is still argued over. Some read it as fierce or strong. Others connect it to the Turkic word for ocean, giving something like oceanic ruler, universal lord, Khan of everything the sky covers. And that ambition was the point. This was not a man declaring himself king of a country. This was a man declaring, in front of every warrior on the plateau, that his authority had no natural border, that it stretched, in principle, as far as the eternal blue sky itself. He built a whole cosmology around it. His authority came not from bloodline. Remember, he had every reason to hate bloodline, but from heaven, from the sky god itself, which had chosen him and given him a mandate to bring the whole world under one rule. It's worth pausing on how dangerous an idea that is. A conventional king wants his kingdom. This man believed he had been appointed by the sky to rule everyone, and that anyone who resisted was not an enemy to be negotiated with, but a rebel against the will of heaven. And rebels are not defeated. They are erased. That single conviction, welded to the finest army on earth, is the reason the next 20 years look the way they do. And now that army had nothing left to conquer on the grass. He had spent his whole life pointing it inward, at the steppe. Now he turned it around. He looked south and west, at the settled world, the walled cities, the irrigated farmland, the packed populations, the caravan roads dripping with silk and silver, and the confederation of horsemen became an instrument aimed at civilization itself. The first great target was to the south, in northern China, a rich and ancient empire that had spent generations treating the steppe nomads as pests to be bribed and divided. His horsemen, who had never in their lives seen a real city wall, learned. They captured Chinese and Persian engineers and put them to work. They learned siege warfare, catapults, battering rams, the machines that throw fire and stone, from the very people they were conquering. A generation earlier, these men had hunted marmots with children's bows. Now they were cracking open fortress cities that had stood for centuries. And the empire in the north began to break. But the moment that turned Genghis Khan from a conqueror into a nightmare the settled world would remember for 800 years. That came out of the West, and it came out of an insult. Far to the west lay one of the wealthiest empires on Earth, a vast Central Asian state ruled by a proud and powerful Shah. This was a jewel box of a civilization. Cities like Samarkand and Bukhara, glittering centers of trade and learning and craft, sitting astride the Silk Road, growing fat on the commerce flowing between China and the Mediterranean. Genghis Khan did not, at first, want to destroy it. He wanted to trade with it. He sent a large, richly loaded caravan, hundreds of merchants, camels heavy with silver and silk and jade, as a gesture of peace and commerce, along with a message proposing friendly relations. The caravan reached a frontier city on the Shah's border, and the governor of that city, a relative of the Shah, greedy or suspicious, or both, accused the merchants of being spies.
He seized the entire caravan and had nearly every man in it executed. Hundreds of traders put to death, their goods stolen. Even then, Genghis Khan did not immediately unleash war. He did something that, in hindsight, feels almost like a test. He sent envoys to the Shah, demanding justice. Hand over the governor, punish him, make this right. He sent ambassadors, protected under the oldest law there is, the law that says you do not harm a messenger. And the Shah's answer sealed the fate of his empire. He had the chief envoy killed and the others humiliated. The sources say their beards were burned off and sent them back so disfigured. Killing merchants was theft. Killing and mutilating ambassadors was a declaration, a spit in the face, an announcement that there would be no justice and no fear. Understand what that meant to Genghis Khan specifically. This was a man whose entire moral universe was built on two things: loyalty rewarded and betrayal punished absolutely. The murder of a guest, he had watched his own father die that way, poisoned as a guest by men who broke the sacred law of hospitality. The harming of envoys was, in his code, among the gravest crimes that existed. The Shah had done both. In Genghis Khan's mind, this was not a diplomatic incident. It was the Tartar poison cup all over again, on the scale of empires. And his response was not proportionate. It was total. He is said to have climbed a sacred mountain, uncovered his head, and prayed for days before he rode, asking heaven for the strength to avenge the wrong. Then he turned an army of perhaps 150,000 or more west, across some of the harshest terrain on the planet, deserts and mountains that armies were not supposed to be able to cross. And he crossed them. He appeared where he could not possibly appear, from the direction no one was watching, and fell on the richest empire in the region, like the wrath of the sky itself. What followed is one of the most concentrated episodes of destruction in recorded history. And the sources, many of them written by the victims, by Persian and Arab historians who watched their own world burn, struggle to find language for it. The great trading cities, the jewels of the Silk Road, were systematically annihilated. When a city resisted, the pattern was merciless and repeated. The population would be driven out onto the plain outside the walls. The soldiers and the strong were killed. The craftsmen and skilled artisans were separated out and shipped east to serve the empire. Because talent, even enemy talent, had value. And remember, this was a man who had always valued what a person could do over who they were. The young women were taken, and the rest, the old, the poor, the useless, were slaughtered. Methodically, sometimes by having each Mongol soldier assigned a quota of heads to take. The chroniclers describe skulls piled into pyramids outside the ruined walls, separate heaps for the men, the women, the children. In one city, so many people were killed that the historian recording it, a man of that region writing not long after, said the number of dead was beyond counting, and that the killing went on until the streets ran with blood, and the survivors who crept back afterward were fewer than could rebuild. He wrote a line that has echoed for centuries, that this was a catastrophe such as had never happened before, and that if the world lasted for ages more, nothing like it would come again. He wrote that he wished his mother had never borne him, so that he would not have had to record it. At Samarkand, at Bukhara, at Merv, at cities whose names were once bywords for wealth and learning, the killing reached a scale that is genuinely hard to hold in the mind. The figures in the sources are almost certainly exaggerated. Hundreds of thousands, over 1 million in a single city, numbers that modern historians treat with deep caution. But strip away the exaggeration, and something horrifying remains. and is not in dispute. Whole cities that had existed for 1,000 years simply stopped existing.
Populations vanished. And it was not only the killing, it was the water. Central Asia was a desert civilization. It lived because of irrigation, thousands of years of patient work, canals and channels carrying river water out onto the dry land to make it bloom, feeding the great cities. The Mongols destroyed the irrigation systems. And once the canals were broken and the men who knew how to maintain them were dead, the water stopped and the fields turned back to desert. Some of those regions never fully recovered, not in a generation, not in a century. You can still see it today on the map. Places that were dense, green, and rich in the 1200s are dry and empty now. Because a war 800 years ago didn't just kill the people, it killed the land's ability to hold people. This is what I mean by reshaped geography. A modern city can be bombed flat and rebuilt in 20 years. This was destruction that changed what the ground itself could do. The proud Shah who had burned an ambassador's beard, he ran. His empire dissolved beneath him, city by city, and he fled west across his own dying realm, with a Mongol column hunting him. Those two brilliant generals, one of them the archer who'd once shot Genghis Khan in the neck and been forgiven, riding him down relentlessly. He died alone and broken on a small island in the Caspian Sea, sick and abandoned, with nothing. The ruler of one of the wealthiest empires on earth, ending his life as a hunted fugitive, with no crown, no army, no country. One insult, one caravan, one decision by one greedy governor, and the richest empire in the region was wiped from the map. By now, Genghis Khan was an old man, well into his 60s, which for a life like his was ancient. He had ridden and fought and conquered without pause for decades, and he was still fighting. The end came, as so much of his life had begun, with a horse. He was back east, campaigning against a kingdom that had failed to send troops when he demanded them. Another broken promise, another betrayal to be punished. And during that campaign, out hunting, he fell from his horse. He was badly injured, and at his age the body does not recover. He grew feverish and sick, and it became clear he was dying. There is a documented conversation, or something close to it, preserved in the sources. The dying man giving final orders to his sons. He was worried, above all, about two things. First, that his death would embolden the enemy he was still fighting, so he ordered that his death be kept an absolute secret until the campaign was finished and the enemy city taken and destroyed. And second, the succession. He had already, before the Western campaign, named a successor, choosing not his eldest, the boy born under the question mark of the Merkit raid, but a younger son known for steadiness and diplomacy, and he made his sons swear to hold the empire together and not tear it apart fighting one another. It's a strangely intimate scene. The man who had conquered half the world, on his deathbed, using his last breath to try to prevent his own sons from destroying what he'd built. The one thing he could not conquer was the future. He died. And then his people did something extraordinary, which is why, to this day, no one on earth knows where his body lies. They kept the secret. The funeral escort carried his body home across the steppe toward Mongolia, toward the sacred mountains of his youth, the ones where he had hidden as a hunted boy. And according to the accounts that come down to us, they killed everyone they met on the road. Every person who saw the funeral procession pass, travelers, herders, anyone, was cut down, so that no one could carry word of the great Khan's death, and so that no one would know which way the body had gone. The soldiers who dug the grave were reportedly killed by other soldiers, and those soldiers may in turn have been killed, so that the location would die with the men who knew it. Some accounts say a river was diverted over the tomb, or 1,000 horses were driven back and forth across the ground until no trace of digging remained, and the grass grew back and swallowed it. A forest was said to have grown over the site, and it worked. It worked completely. 800 years later, with satellites and ground radar and every tool of modern archaeology, the tomb of the man who conquered more of the earth than anyone in history has never been found. We do not know where he lies. He entered the earth of the steppe that made him and vanished into it as totally as he had once vanished into a river with a wooden collar floating beside his head. The boy who was terrified of dying nameless became the most famous conqueror who ever lived and disappeared without a grave. What he left behind is almost beyond comprehension. At its height, the empire his sons and grandsons expanded stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the gates of Europe, from the Siberian forests to the deserts of the Middle East, the largest contiguous land empire the world has ever known. And it may never be matched. For a while, one road ran unbroken from Korea to Hungary under a single law, and a merchant could travel that entire span in relative safety, an ancient superhighway of trade and ideas and disease and technology, connecting the ends of the earth as they had never been connected before. Gunpowder moved west along it. Paper, printing, plague. The Black Death that would kill a third of Europe rode that same network of roads. The world got smaller because one man forced it together at sword point. And here's the fact that ends where we began. Studies of the genetics of populations across a huge swath of Asia have found a specific male lineage, carried today by an enormous number of men, millions upon millions of living people, that traces back to a single origin in Mongolia, around the time of the Great Conquests. Historians and geneticists cannot prove it belongs to Genghis Khan himself, and they're careful to say so. But the pattern fits him and his male line almost too perfectly to ignore. If it's true, then the boy who was left on the open grass to die, the boy in the wooden collar, the joke of the steppe, is quite literally the ancestor of a measurable fraction of the human race walking the earth right now. The abandoned child became, in the most physical way imaginable, the father of nations. Look back at the whole arc of it. Nothing about it was inevitable. A different winter, a different river current on the night he hid from the search party, a different old man who chose to give him up instead of lie for him, and the collared boy dies nameless in the grass, exactly as he feared. And the world never learns the name, Genghis Khan. It all turned on moments this small. That's the thing I can't quite get past. We tell the story as if the empire was written in the stars, as if a man like that was always going to happen. He wasn't. He was made by cruelty, by betrayal, by a mother digging roots to keep him alive, by strangers who protected a sparrow, and by a single, radical decision a hunted teenager made, lying in cold water. That blood means nothing, and loyalty means everything. He built a world on that idea. Then he was gone, into an unmarked grave the earth still refuses to give up. If this is the kind of history you want more of, the real story, the human one underneath the legend, then subscribe and stay with this channel, because there are 100 more stories like this waiting in the past, and we're only just getting to them. The scourge of half the world started as a boy who was left to die. Remember that the next time someone tells you a person's fate is fixed at birth. His wasn't. And somewhere under the grass of Mongolia, in a grave no living person has ever seen,
The proof of it is still lying there, keeping its last secret.